Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I am your host as always, Professor Prime. So, today's video, math in comics. Yeah, so I want to definitely talk about that today, because I have a couple things that I'm thinking about with that. So, how does math connect to comics? Let's talk about it. So I kind of want to talk about like the layout of a comic and kind of coming at that from a creator standpoint, and then talk about like as someone who's like reading it, and then talk about like how it's actually used in comics, like as a plot device sometimes and things like that, something along those edges, and then talk about it in a more meta sense as well, like well, how is it used like outside of all the things that I mentioned. So let's begin. So when I think about comics, I think about how math relates. One of the first things that comes into mind is actually the structure of a comic book itself. Comics are sequential art. They have a certain order to them, and you can play around with it according to your style. But when you're making a comic, right, you're trying to get a story across in this particular issue. If it's an ongoing story, several issues, but let's focus on just a issue for a second. So when you're doing that, right, let's say you're making an issue of something like Spider-Man, for instance. Then you have someone who's going along and they're plotting it, and then if you're structuring that comic book, you want to say, well, how many pages do I want this to be? And on each page, how many panels do I want to put? And then you gotta like keep in mind the space of each panel that you're making because you want to make everything count, right? And so you have to ask those sort of questions like, well, how long is this comic going to be? Can I tell the story I need to in this time? How am I going to break up the panels? And where am I going to place like speech bubbles or thought bubbles and things like that? And you have to pay attention as an artist to what you're drawing and how you draw this or draw that. And there's geometry in that, and I think that's pretty cool because whether you mean to or not, you're doing math if you're doing that. And so when you're doing that creative process, you're all working together, and you got your plotter, you got your artist, and I don't think this gets talked about much. You got your anchor, and so they have to follow along the patterns that's been laid out for them, and they could do certain things like cross hatching um, to make things pop. So I think that's pretty cool. And then on the reading side, you're following along with each page, right? And you're following the pattern that's been laid out. You're reading the images, and so math gets involved in that, 'cause, and the time that you spend reading it. And I think that gets pretty interesting too, because it depends on like how fast you read, like how much you'll get out of that. So you want to pace yourself too, so you can make it maybe a more enjoyable ride. Really take things in, and also a lot of us are on a budget. Comics are expensive, so you want to make sure you're getting something that you want. And then on top of that, you got to pay attention to what issue number you're on, and in what book, and if there's tie-ins, corresponding issues with that. So that's how I see it for like a reader, among other things. And so there's that. And what was I thinking? Oh yeah, yeah. So and sometimes even within the stories themselves, there's math. Because oftentimes you'll see like these super scientists, and they're doing a bunch of math, they're doing all that, and sometimes you'll use it as a plot device or something crazy. Like one of the weirdest things is like Darkseid from DC, like and his whole anti-life equation. It's so ambiguous like what that is, but I mean it's supposed to let you take over someone, but it's just like weird that there's an equation for it that they think about it that way. Um, but that's a whole other story for another day. It's ill-defined, I'll say that, but interesting. But speaking of DC, they have another character that's noted for mapping involved, but I don't think people necessarily think about it that way. So, and I'm going to like look at my screen on my computer just to make sure I get it right, because it's been a while. So yeah, Johnny Quick, a speedster from DC, like flashes. Um, the way he activates his powers is through a math formula, and it's one of those things where I think it's awesome, but at the same time, it looks so just weird and obnoxious, um, but kind of cool. I don't know. Like I'll be probably using that as an image um, for the thumbnail, so you can see that and just like writing it in the comments. But like it's 3x2, then 9yz 4a, and when Johnny Quick would think of that, he would activate his powers, and it's just like that's so bizarre. Like why? I I don't know actually, and if someone did know, I mean, please feel free. But I don't feel like it was ever explained, or at least like thoroughly. But yeah, so there's all that, but then there's of course the meta side of it, and I'm gonna focus on the big two like Marvel and DC because like they have like interesting histories with all this. So you have people like putting together the comics, and telling the stories, and there's math and all that. There's math and you reading the comics and keeping up with different issues and things along those lines. And there's probably some other things that I didn't think about with it too, because like I guess the logic that you pick up in math can really help you like map out the comic too. But all that aside, if you look at the big picture, you look at the meta narrative that's being told, like comics these days um, make a lot of money, and I guess maybe not like buying comic books, but comic book movies make a lot of money, and so that there's a lot involved with that, right? There's a lot of math involved in money, so there's a lot of math involved in that, and I think it's interesting to note that was it 12 years ago or so, Disney bought out Marvel, who was struggling after like the 90s and all that, because that was the big comic book boom. Like it got kind of crazy. I was there for that. I'm old, but I grew up like in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, and I mean comics were really really weird even for comics back then, but very unique. The 90s had a very unique sense of comics, but yeah. So you know with Marvel, they got bought out by Disney, and since then, like Disney has like put a lot into the Marvel movies. The MCU is just commonly known, and all of that has so much crazy math in it because like they're looking at what they can make, sure, and then they're looking at what storylines might be profitable, might work, and then you have studios interacting with people who are creatives on the projects, and that gets interesting because everyone wants money, but people want to tell a story too. So it's interesting to see how that all plays out. And DC saw what Marvel did and tried to imitate, the shared universe, like a lot of other people did for a while, but no one's been able to really capture what the MCU did, and I think that's interesting. And I like most of their movies, not all of them, but a good deal of them. And it's definitely interesting to see the backstory with what goes on behind the scenes with that. But my whole point is, there's a lot of math in the process. Like I think more than people would think with comics, and I think of a lot of it is the money, of course, but I think a lot of it actually works with the creative side on it. And fun fact, once upon a time I took a comic book class, and I made a comic as a final project because we had like the option of writing a paper, like a detailed research paper, or making a comic. Some people actually went with the research paper. That was never really an option for me. I made a comic, and it was about a supervillain named Prime and his origin story. Don't worry, I'm not a villain, allegedly. But no, I'm not. But I have the voice for it, and I've been known to make needlessly elaborate plans in monologue a lot. So there's that. But yeah, so I didn't want this to drag on too long, but these are just some of the ways that I see math and comics like interconnecting. And if you think of some yourself, I mean, please feel free to know. I'm sure there's a lot more out there that I didn't mention. So yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Professor Prime out.